Hi, my name is Mariam. Today we're going to take a look at the fourth chapter of the 0470 history syllabus, which is Who was to blame for the Cold War? The Cold War was basically tension between the Soviet Communist East with the capitalistic West. So here. World War II alliance and the clash of ideologies. The USA, USSR, and Britain were the allies who fought together against Germany, Italy, and Japan, the Axis powers during World War II. The Soviets had been communists at this point for more than 30 years. Britain and American politicians were wary of communist ideas. On the other hand, Britain and the USA played a role in supporting communist enemies, hence, the USSR feared its allies. So, the clash of ideologies. The USA was capitalist, right? Everything is privately owned, minimal interference of the state in private business affairs. And it's also a democracy. The government officials were chosen in free democratic elections. The USA was the world's wealthiest country with extreme wealth inequality. It had been alarmed by communist theory of spreading the Red Revolution to all parts of the world. Most Americans believed that countries should be run the American capitalistic way. Being free of government control is more important than everyone being equal. In contrast, the USSR upheld a political system that everything should be owned by the state. It was also a one-party dictatorship. All candidates belonged to the Communist Party, and there was no such thing as free elections. It was an economic superpower, the same as the USA, but it had a lower standard of living. And the unemployment rate was low, and there were very rare cases of extreme poverty. The rights of individuals were seen as less important than the good of society. The Soviets believed, the same as the Americans, that other countries should be run their way. Communist ideology promoted communist revolutions abroad, but communist leaders took practical decisions when it came to policy. Many saw the US actions as selfishly building an economic imperial empire. The Yalta Conference took place in February of 1945, and the Allied leaders met to discuss what would happen to Europe after Germany's inevitable defeat. It contributed to a lack of distrust between the great powers due to Stalin displaying his self-interest at the talks. The big three at that time were the USA, Britain, and the USSR, namely President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin. There were several agreements at Yalta. For one, they agreed that Stalin would enter the war against Japan after Germany had surrendered. When it came to Germany, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin agreed to divide Germany into four zones: British, French, American, and Soviet. Elections agreed that as countries were liberated, their people could hold free elections to choose their own governments. The Big Three would join a new United Nations to replace the old League of Nations and as a way to keep the peace. The Big Three would hunt down and punish war criminals responsible for the Nazi death camps. In Eastern Europe, 20 million people had died, and the USSR had been invaded during the war, Operation Barbarossa. Stalin was concerned. The Big Three agreed that Eastern Europe would become the Soviet sphere of influence. But there were also disagreements at Yalta. For one, Stalin wanted the USSR border to extend westward into Poland. He argued that in return, Poland could extend into Germany. Churchill did not agree with Stalin's ideas, but he knew that there was not much he could do since the Red Army already controlled much of Eastern Germany. FDR was unhappy with Stalin's plans, but Churchill convinced him to accept them so long as the USSR would stay out of Greece, where the British were trying to stop the communists, and Stalin complied. Not long after the Yalta Conference was the Potsdam Conference, which took part in May of 1945, immediately after Germany had surrendered. Hitler had committed suicide by this point, and the Allied troops reached Berlin. In July, it took place. The situation was very different by this point because America had a new president. Roosevelt had died and he was replaced by Vice President Harry Truman. Truman was a lot more anti-communist and he had heightened suspicions of Stalin and his motives. Truman viewed Soviet actions in Eastern Europe as preparation for a Soviet European takeover, and he wanted to stop this as much as possible. The Allies had already tested an atomic bomb by this point. In July, they had tested an atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the start of the conference, Truman informed Stalin of this. Stalin's Red Army were occupying Eastern Europe. The Red Army liberated concentration camps, but instead of withdrawing troops, Stalin left them there. He set up a communist government in Poland, ignoring the wishes of many Poles, and this went against what they had agreed at Yalta. Nevertheless, he insisted that this was nothing less than a defensive measure against an attack. Over the next 9 months, Stalin achieved domination of Eastern Europe. He took over Poland, Hungary, Albania, Romania, and Bulgaria by 1946. In his Fulton speech, Churchill described the border between communist countries and the West as an iron curtain. The Fulton speech contributed to a lack of trust between the great powers due to the USSR expansionist ideals. Churchill blatantly pointed out the separation between the East and the West. Stalin tightened his control in each country through the help of his secret police and as a way of making sure that communism remained. In 1947, he set up a Cominform to coordinate the work of communist parties throughout Europe. He kept a close eye on the leaders of each party in each country from Moscow, and he spotted independent-minded leaders and replaced them with those loyal to him and only him. Stalin saw expansionism as a way of making him secure. Truman only saw the ideological spread of communism via revolution. Czechoslovakia and Greece were the only non-communist countries by 1948. Events in these two countries were to have a significant effect on American foreign policy in the years to come. In 1947, the Nazis had retreated from Greece. The communists who wanted a Soviet republic, the monarchists wanted a return of the king. Churchill sent British troops in 1945 to restore order and help instill free elections. The British supported the monarchists, and the king returned to power. In 1945, the USSR protested to the UN that the British presence threatened the peace in Greece. The UN did nothing, so a civil war ensued. The British, however, could not afford to fight a new war and withdrew in February of 1947. American intervention in Greece followed as Truman paid for British soldiers to prop up the king's government. Under the Truman Doctrine, the US was prepared to send money, equipment, and advice to any country that was being actively threatened by communism. He accepted Eastern Europe was communist, but he wanted to contain it to only Eastern Europe. The aim of stopping the spread of communism manifested into a policy of containment. The Marshall Plan. Truman believed that communism succeeded when people were forced into poverty. Secretary of State George Marshall was sent to assess the economic state of Europe. European countries collectively owned the US $11.5 billion. They faced a variety of problems that made repayment impossible. For one, refugees, homelessness, food and clothing shortages were among those issues. Marshall suggested 17 billion was needed to rebuild Europe post-World War II. In December 1947, Congress refused to comply with Truman. Many wanted a return to isolationism, as seen previously after World War I. Czechoslovakia, 1948. American attitude changed with the Czechs when they turned Soviet. Czechoslovakia had been ruled by a coalition government that pursued policies independent of Moscow. Anti-communism was purged in March of 1948. Pro-American ministers were murdered. Immediately, Congress accepted the Marshall Plan. On one hand, the Marshall aid was extremely generous. On the other hand, it was motivated by self-interest. For one, the USA wanted to create new foreign markets for American goods. Truman needed to avoid the Great Depression from happening again. Politicians also wanted an open-door policy in trade with no tariffs or trade restrictions to limit profits. Aid should only be given to states that totally embrace democracy and free marketeerism. Stalin grew suspicious and banned Eastern European countries from applying to it. He saw an anti-communist aim that would weaken his control in the East, and he felt that America was trying to dominate the Soviet sphere of influence by making countries dependent on the dollar. The Berlin blockade. Germany was divided into British, American, French, and Soviet zones post-World War II. And the American plan was to remove all German industry and render Germany an agricultural state. However, as Truman grew suspicious of the USSR, he decided a strong Germany was actually a useful ally in opposing communism. Additionally, if the German industries could not recover, millions of people would starve. So in 1946, Britain, France, and the USA combined their zones to create a West Germany state. Stalin needed to show the West that he would fight back if they dared to encroach on the Soviet sphere of influence. Berlin was linked to West Germany by railways and canals. It was, however, in the Soviet zone. In 1948, Stalin blocked supply lines. If the USA tried to ram Soviet roadblocks, it could be interpreted as an act of war. Stalin wanted Truman to announce withdrawal and grant the USSR a propaganda and territorial victory. The Berlin airlift. The Americans knew that the western zone of Germany would be next to fall to Stalin if they were to give in. So Truman ordered the aircraft to send supplies to Berlin. No shots were fired on the planes that dropped aid. For the next 10 months, West Berlin received supplies via airdrops, and the blockade would be officially lifted in May 1949. War between the USA and the USSR seemed imminent, and at the height of the crisis, Western powers met at Washington, D.C. to form an alliance, which would be called the North Atlantic Trade Organization, or NATO. Although the USSR remained critical of NATO, Stalin took no action. In 1955, West Germany was allowed to join NATO. NATO members signed an agreement to work together, and soon after West Germany joined NATO, Stalin retaliated by forming the Warsaw Pact. Similarly, communist states promised to protect each other's interests from the West. Consequences of the Berlin blockade. It was an ideological symbol. Berlin symbolized Cold War victory. To America, Berlin was an oasis of democratic freedom in a desert of communist repression. To the USSR, it was a cancer growing in the workers' paradise of Eastern Germany. The Cold War was no man's land. Berlin was a place where the Americans and the Soviets could practically face off. It was vulnerable to either party attacking, and it was where each side would fight proxy wars and show that they would never trust each other.